They would say afterward that the hall had never been so quiet, not even when the old Duke had died in the middle of the winter session, with the candles guttering and the snow pressed like a hand against the tall windows. They would say the quiet came down all at once, the way a curtain comes down, and that in the middle of it stood a woman in grey who did not tremble. It was the particular quiet of a great many well-bred people deciding, in the same instant, that they had seen nothing, that they would remember nothing, that whatever happened in the next moment would be a thing they had been looking away from when it occurred. The court had gathered that evening for a presentation, the sort of small ceremony that meant nothing and settled everything, where rank was measured in the space between one person and another, and a place at the front of a room could be worth more than a fortune in land. The chandeliers had been lit, all of them, which was itself a kind of announcement, and the long mirrors down one wall doubled the crowd until it seemed there were twice as many witnesses as there truly were. Which perhaps there were, for a thing seen in a mirror is remembered as surely as a thing seen plain. She had come in on her husband's arm because that was expected, and she had stood where a duchess stands, one pace behind and to the right of him, close enough to be seen, far enough to be forgotten. She was not a woman who asked to be looked at. She had learned long ago that the surest way to be left in peace was to give no one a reason to remember your face, and so she had made a study of stillness, and she was very good at it, and it had never once occurred to her that stillness could be turned into a weapon against her until the moment her husband turned and looked at her as though she were a piece of furniture that had been placed in the wrong room. "Kiss her slipper," he said. He did not raise his voice. That was the thing they all remembered, that he did not raise his voice at all, that he said it the way a man might ask for the salt, and that he was not looking at his wife when he said it, but at the other woman, the one in the crimson gown, with the diamonds at her throat, the one who had been seated that evening in the chair that should have been the Duchess's own. There is a particular cruelty in a command given softly, for a shout can be forgiven as temper, and a soft word cannot. A soft word has been considered. A soft word is a decision. The mistress smiled, and it was a slow smile, a smile that had been practised in a glass, and she extended her foot the smallest distance from beneath the hem of her skirt, a satin slipper the colour of wine, and she let it hang there in the bright air, and the whole court understood in one breath what was being asked and why, and not one of them moved to stop it. Because he was the Duke, and because it is easier to watch a cruelty than to interrupt one. A lady near the front lifted her fan. A gentleman studied the buckle of his own shoe as though he had never seen it before. The old Marchioness, who had known 3 generations of the family, closed her eyes and did not open them, and that was the whole of her protest, and she would carry the shame of its smallness to her grave. If you have ever been made small in a room full of people who could have spoken and chose instead to study the ceiling, if you have ever felt the particular cold that comes when the person who is supposed to stand between you and the world steps aside and lets the world have you, then you already know what she felt, and you will understand why she did what she did next, and you will understand that it was not weakness. Tell me, if you will, in the quiet where you are listening, whether you have ever stood in such a room. She looked at her husband for the length of a single held breath. She did not plead with her eyes, because pleading was a language she had given up years before, when she learned that no one at that court ever answered it. She looked at him the way a person looks at a door they are about to walk through, measuring it, weighing what was on the far side of it against what was behind, and finding, in the space of that one breath, that there was nothing behind her at all worth keeping. Then she gathered her grey skirts in both hands, and she knelt on the cold marble before the woman in crimson. And the marble was very cold, colder than she had expected, the cold of a floor that has never in its life been warmed by anything. And she bent her head, and she kissed the satin slipper once, lightly, the way one kisses a thing one does not love, and the sound her lips made against the fabric was the only sound in the hall, a small sound, and it carried, because the hall had made itself silent to receive it. Then she rose. She did not hurry. She smoothed her grey skirts as though she had merely stooped to retrieve a dropped glove, and she looked at no one, and she did not look at him at all, which was the thing he noticed and could not afterwards stop noticing, that she did not once look at him. And she turned, and she walked the length of that long bright hall alone, past the marble faces of the people she had known for the whole of her married life, past the Marchioness who had shut her eyes, and the lady with the fan, and the gentleman with the fascinating buckle, past all the doubled faces in the long mirrors. And she did not stumble, and she did not weep, and her back was very straight. And there was in the set of her shoulders a thing that some of the wiser people in that room recognized even then and were troubled by, which was that she was not fleeing. A woman who flees has been beaten. This woman walked as though she had concluded a piece of business and was going home. When she reached the great doors, a footman opened them, because he did not know what else to do, a young man with a burn of colour high in his cheeks, and she inclined her head to him, to the footman, as though he were the only person in the hall who had behaved with any decency, and perhaps he was. And she passed through the doors into the dark, and the doors closed behind her, and the court let out its breath at last, all together. A long, ragged exhalation like wind in a chimney. He did not follow her. He would spend a great many nights of his life understanding why he did not follow her, and he would never arrive at an answer that did not shame him. Her name was Eleanor, and she had not married the Duke for love, and she had never once pretended otherwise, not to him, not to herself, not to the aunt who had arranged the whole thing across a table in a cold morning room 3 winters before, with the frost thick on the glass and the accounts spread between them like the entrails of some dead thing. She had been the daughter of a merchant whose ships had come home empty 1 too many times, a man who had loved his figures and trusted them and been betrayed by them, and when he died, he left her a name that meant nothing, and a set of ledgers that meant a great deal. Because Eleanor had kept those ledgers since she was 14 years old. And she understood money the way other women of her station understood music or French, as a thing she had been raised inside of and could hear when it went wrong. She could look at a column of a merchant's figures and know, the way a physician knows a fever by the wrist, whether the house behind them was dying or only frightened. Her father had taught her this in the good years, sitting her on a high stool at his elbow in the counting-house that smelled of tar and ink and cold tea, and he had said to her more than once that a person who can read a ledger need never be at any man's mercy. And he had been wrong about that, as he had been wrong about the ships. But the skill itself had been true, even when the promise attached to it was not. The Duke had needed a wife who would not embarrass him, and who came with a small clean fortune and no relations to speak of, and she had needed a roof and a name and a wall between herself and the poverty that had swallowed her father, and so they had made their bargain. And it had been an honest one, and for a time it had even been something close to a peace. The aunt had put it to her plainly, in that cold morning room, an old woman with terrible clear eyes even then, saying that her nephew was not a lover and would not pretend to be one, that he wanted a manager and a name to hang beside his own, and nothing warmer, and that a girl with a head like Eleanor's could do a great deal worse than a cold roof over a warm one, for cold roofs at least did not leak. And Eleanor, who had spent the winter of her father's death watching the creditors carry the furniture out of the house one piece at a time, had looked across the frost-bright table at the old woman and said that she understood the terms and accepted them. And she had meant it, and she had not wept, because she had already done all her weeping in a house with no furniture in it. He was not a cruel man by nature. That was the part the court never understood, and the part that made the whole thing so much worse. He was a man who had been taught, young and thoroughly, that warmth was a kind of exposure, that to be seen wanting was to be seen weak. And he had built himself a life in which he never wanted anything visibly, and into that life a wife who kept his accounts better than any steward and never asked him for a single tender word, had fit like a key into a lock. His own mother had been a woman of great beauty and greater disappointment, who had let her son understand very early that he was not quite what she had hoped for, that he was a settlement of a debt rather than a joy, and he had learned from her the lesson that all such children learn, which is to want nothing, to ask for nothing, to build the wall high and man it well, so that no one might ever again look at you and find you wanting, and let you see them find it. He had grown used to Eleanor. He had grown, though he would not have used the word and could not have borne to hear it, fond of her, in the flat, undemanding way a man grows fond of a good horse or a well-made coat, and it was precisely because he had begun to feel that fondness stir into something with a pulse in it that he had reached for the mistress in the first place, because a thing with a pulse could be lost. And a man who has never learned to hold what he loves will often break it first, to be sure of where the pieces are. She had known about the woman in crimson for some months. One always knows. It is not the grand betrayals that tell you, but the small rearrangements of a household. The way a servant's eyes slide away when you enter a room they were speaking in. The new accounts that do not balance because someone has been buying diamonds and charging them to the estate, and Eleanor had found those accounts the way she found everything, by reading the figures until they confessed. There had been an entry for a jeweller in the town, and then another, sums that no household ordered honestly, and she had sat with the ledger open on her knee one evening, and understood the whole of it in the space of a minute, the way she understood everything, all at once and without drama, and she had closed the ledger and gone down to supper and said nothing. She had told herself that a marriage of convenience has no right to jealousy, that she had bargained for a roof and not for a heart, and she had almost believed it, and the almost was the trouble. For somewhere in the long, ordinary evenings of the past 3 years she had begun, without meaning to hope. She had noticed the way he left a book open at the page he thought she would like, never saying that he had done it, only leaving it there on the table by her chair, a small silent offering he would have denied making if she had ever named it. She had noticed that he had begun to say, when he spoke of the estate, we shall drain the low meadow, we shall not renew the mill lease, and that the word had come to sit warm in her chest each time he used it, though she had been careful never to let her face show that it did. There had been an evening in the second winter when the fire had burned low and neither of them had rung for it to be built up, and they had sat together in the dimming room in a silence that was, for once, not the silence of two strangers sharing a roof, but something else, something that had a shape to it, and he had said, out of nothing, that he was glad she was not a foolish woman. And she had understood that from him this was a kind of tenderness, perhaps the only kind he had, and she had let herself on the coldest nights after that. Imagine that the bargain might one day thaw into something she did not have a name for. And then he had told her to kneel in front of his mistress and kiss the woman's shoe, and the hope had not shattered so much as it had simply been shown to her, plainly, as a thing she had made up out of nothing, a thing that had never once been defended in public, and that was the cruelty inside the cruelty. He had not merely humiliated her. He had proved, in front of the only witnesses that mattered, that whatever she had let herself feel had been hers alone, that the we had been a habit of his tongue and not a fact of his heart. And a person can survive being hated far more easily than being gently, absent-mindedly erased. She went to the dower house that stood empty at the edge of the estate, a low grey building with a single lamp that the caretaker kept burning out of habit, and she let herself in, and she sat down in the cold, and only then, alone, with the door shut and the last of the carriages gone from the great house across the park, did she allow herself one small private gesture of grief. She took off the grey glove of her right hand, the hand nearest the marble when she knelt, and she looked at it for a long moment, and then she pressed the back of that bare hand once against her mouth, hard, the way one presses a wound to stop it, and she held it there while her shoulders shook once, twice, in the empty room, and then she took the hand away, and she put the glove back on, and she did not take the grief out again for a very long time. In the morning she began to work. She had brought nothing with her but a single case of papers, and those papers were the whole of her power, because Eleanor had never in 3 years stopped keeping the accounts of the estate, and she knew, as no one else living knew, exactly what the Duke owned and exactly what he owed and exactly how thin the thread was that held the two apart. She did not intend to ruin him. That was never in her, and she would have been insulted to be thought capable of it. For she did not deal in ruin, she dealt in truth, and the truth was that the house across the park could not stand a week without her, and did not know it yet. But she intended for the first time in her life to stop being a thing that was placed in rooms and asked to be still. The great house learned her absence the way a body learns the loss of a sense, slowly and then all at once. For the first days the Duke told himself that she had gone to sulk and would return, because that was what the women he had known in his youth had done. They had withdrawn to be pursued, and he had never in his life pursued anyone, and did not mean to begin. But the household did not run as it had run. Bills came that no one could read, because the hand that had read them was gone. A tenant arrived to renew a lease and stood in the hall turning his hat in his hands, because there was no one who knew what the terms had been, and the Duke had to send the man away without an answer, which had never in living memory happened at that house, and the tenant went home and told his wife, and his wife told her sister, and so the small ordinary rot of it spread outward through the county before the Duke had even understood that a thing had begun to rot. The steward, a dry and careful man named Pruitt, who had served the family for 30 years, and who had a way of reporting disasters as though remarking on the weather, came to the Duke one evening and laid a ledger on the table and said, in his flat and unhurried voice, that he could not for the life of him make the figures come right, and that he had found, going back, that they had not been right in some years, that someone had been quietly making them right, and that the someone was no longer in the house. The Duke opened the ledger and looked at the margins, and there in a small clean hand he had seen 1,000 times and never once read, were her notes, her corrections, her patient reasonings, the whole shape of her mind laid out in ink beside the columns. Here she had caught an error of the old steward's and set it right without a word of reproach. Here she had noted, 2 years gone, that the dyke along the low fields was failing, and would want £200 spent on it before the 3rd winter, or it would cost 10 times as much. And beside her note, in the Duke's own careless hand, was the single word later, which he had written and forgotten, and which now looked up at him off the page like an accusation. He turned the pages, and the further he read, the worse it became, not because the accounts were bad, but because they were so good, because on every leaf was the evidence of a mind that had been holding his whole world upright with both hands while he looked the other way. And he found that he was reading her margins the way another man might read a letter from a woman he loved, hungrily ashamed of the hunger. And the discovery came over him slowly, and with a kind of horror, that he had lived beside this mind for 3 years, and had told it to kneel on cold marble in front of a woman who could not have balanced a butcher's bill. He began, in the nights that followed, to walk the house. He had never before troubled to notice the rooms he lived in, but now he moved through them in the small hours with a candle, and he found her everywhere and nowhere, the way one finds a person newly gone. Here was the chair she had sat in of an evening, and the small table beside it where a book had always lain open. And the table was bare now, and the bareness of it was louder than any words. Here was the still room where she had kept the household in order, the labelled jars in her clean hand, the whole quiet machinery of a great house running, all of it stopped, all of it waiting for a hand that did not come. He stood one night at the door of the room that had been hers and did not go in, and he understood, standing there, that a house is not stone and timber, but the attention of the person who loves it, and that his had loved his house better than he had loved anything, himself included, and that he had sent that love across the park into a cold grey building with one lamp, and had called it discipline, and had gone to supper. He did not sleep much that season. A man does not, who has begun at last to see himself plainly by candlelight in the empty rooms of what he has broken. He did not go to her. Pride is a wall a man builds to keep out the weather, and then discovers he has built around himself, and he stood inside his, and he told himself a great many things, that a duke cannot chase a runaway wife across his own park, that she would come back when the cold and the loneliness had done their work, that the woman in crimson was better suited to his life in any case, being a creature of the same surface he was, all polish and no depth. He said the last of these things aloud one evening at supper to the mistress herself, and she smiled and agreed with him, and he watched her agree, and something in the ease of her agreement turned in his stomach like a bad oyster. For the woman in crimson had never once corrected him. She had never told him a lease was foolish or a figure wrong. She had never, in all the months of their acquaintance, offered him a single thing he did not already want to hear. And he had mistaken the flattery for warmth because he had never in his life been offered the real thing, and did not know its taste. She laughed at his jokes a half-second before they were finished. She admired the very opinions he had walked in holding. She was a mirror in a crimson gown, and he had gazed into her and thought he was looking at a companion, and now, with his wife's ledger open on the table between them, he began, that evening, to see her clearly, and clarity is a mercy that arrives too late more often than not. It was his aunt who named it for him, because someone always must, and in that family it had always been the aunt, a dowager of enormous age and no patience, who had buried 2 husbands and a great many illusions, and who arrived at the great house uninvited in the middle of the following week with her cane and her carriage and her terrible clear eyes. She found her nephew in the library pretending to read, and she sat down across from him without being asked, and she looked at him for a long time in silence, letting the silence do the first part of the work, as she always did, and then she said that she had heard what he had done at the court. She said that the whole county had heard, that they were speaking of it in houses where they had never before troubled to speak of him at all, and that he would do well to understand that they were not speaking of his wife. They were speaking of him. She told him that his wife had done the one thing that could not be answered, that she had obeyed him, exactly and completely and in front of everyone, and that by obeying him she had handed him the whole of the shame, because a man who is defied can rage, a man who is defied can call his opponent unnatural and shrill and win the room with it, but a man who is obeyed has nothing to push against and only himself to look at. She knelt, the old woman said. She knelt the way you told her, and she kissed the shoe the way you told her, and then she stood up. And do you know what she left on that floor when she rose? She left you. She left the whole of you, kneeling there in everyone's mind, and she walked out clean. She told him that he had married a woman worth 10 of the painted thing he was keeping, and that he had known it, and that knowing it was what he could not forgive her, because a small man cannot bear to be saved, and a coward cannot bear to be loved by someone braver than himself. Then she rose, and she rapped her cane once against the floor, hard the way one raps to wake a sleeper, and she said that she had loved his father, who had also been a coward, and that she was too old to stand and watch the son dig the same grave with his own 2 hands. And she went to bed in the room that had always been hers, and left him with the truth sitting in the chair where she had been. There was a child in the house that season, a girl of 9, a ward, the orphaned daughter of a cousin, a small grave creature, who noticed everything and said almost nothing, and who had loved the Duchess with the fierce silent loyalty that children keep for the adults who treat them as though their questions matter. Eleanor had been the only person in that great cold house who had ever answered the child's questions as though they were real, who had shown her how the columns of figures added up and let her hold the pen, and taught her that the world could be understood if one was only patient enough with it, that nothing in it was truly magic, that even the frightening things were only sums one had not yet learned to do. The child had felt the Duchess go the way one feels a fire go out in a room in winter, not all at once, but as a slow creeping in of the cold from the corners, and she had gone about the house in the days after with a white pinched look that no one but the servants troubled to notice. She came to the Duke some days after the aunt, in the hour before supper, and she stood in the doorway of the library until he noticed her, holding the frame with both small hands as though she might need to run. And when he asked her, not unkindly, what she wanted, she did not answer the question he had asked. She asked her own. She wanted to know, she said in the flat, unanswerable way of children, why he had made his wife kiss the lady's shoe, when his wife was the kindest person in the whole house and the lady was not kind at all. And did he not know that that she had pinched the child once on the arm for standing too near her skirts, and had smiled while she did it? And then, before he could find anything at all to say to this, she asked the second question, the one that went into him like a splinter under a nail and stayed there for the rest of his life. She wanted to know whether, if she herself were ever bad, if she spilled the ink again or spoke when she oughtn't, he would make her kneel down in front of everyone too. She asked it without accusation, which was the terrible thing. She asked it the way one asks about a rule of the house one is trying to learn, so as to keep safe within it, and he understood that she was afraid of him. That she had perhaps always been a little afraid of him, and had hidden it as children hide such things, and that the only person who had ever made the great cold house feel safe to her had walked out of it because of what he had done. He looked at the child, and he opened his mouth, and he found that he could not speak at all, that there was no answer he could give that would not be either a lie or a horror. And the child, taking his silence for the answer it was, gave a small nod, as though a thing she had feared had been confirmed, and went quietly away down the dark corridor. And he sat alone in the library with the splinter in him, and did not go down to supper. The woman in crimson overplayed her hand, as such women in such stories always do, not because they are stupid, but because they have mistaken a man's weakness for his nature and cannot conceive that the weakness might one day be ashamed of itself. She came to him with a demand, made prettily, as all her demands were made. She wanted the Duchess's jewels, the old ones, the ones that had belonged to his mother and his grandmother, the pearls and the sapphires that lived in the locked drawer and came out only for the greatest occasions, and she wanted them not privately, but publicly. She wanted to wear them at the assembly at the end of the month, where the whole county would see, and she framed it as her right, as the natural order of a thing that had already been settled the night the Duchess knelt. "She is gone," the woman said, winding a curl about one white finger, "and I am here. And it is absurd that jewels should sit in a drawer when there is a throat to wear them. You made your choice at the court, before them all. Let the county see it finished, and the Duke, who a month before would have given her the jewels without a thought, without even the interest of a decision, found that his hand would not move to the drawer." He looked at the woman asking, at the pretty practised face and the white winding finger and the appetite behind the eyes that the beauty had always before disguised, and he saw the whole of his future in that face, a future of surfaces, of being reflected forever back at himself, of a house with no one in it who would ever once tell him he was wrong, of growing old beside a mirror and calling it a marriage. He saw, laid against it, the small clean hand in the margins of the ledger, the £200 she had begged him to spend on the dyke, the book left open at the page she would like, the word "we sitting warm in his chest on a winter evening," and he understood at last, wholly and with no way left to unknow it. The difference between a woman who wanted him and a woman who had only ever wanted his rank and his rooms and his mother's sapphires. He told her no. He told her no quietly, in the same flat voice he had used to tell his wife to kneel, and there was a justice in that which he felt even as he spoke, that the voice which had done the wrong should be the one to begin undoing it. He watched the masks slip on her painted face, watched the pretty softness go out of it all at once like a lamp turned down, and he saw what had been underneath it the whole time. And it was nothing, it was appetite and cold, and a kind of contempt for him that had been there from the first hour, and that he had been too flattered to see, and he was ashamed, deeply and privately ashamed of every single hour he had spent in its company. He told her to leave his house. She left it within the day, and she took her contempt with her, and the county, which had watched her come, watched her go, and drew its own conclusions, and they were not kind to her, and not yet kind to him either. But shame is not repair, and he knew it, and the aunt knew it, and even the child knew it, and Eleanor, in the dower house across the park with her papers and her single lamp, knew it best of all, and expected nothing. It was not enough to have sent the mistress away. A man who removes a knife has not thereby healed the wound, he has only stopped making it deeper. The county was still talking. The tenants were still uneasy. The child still flinched a little when he came into a room, and there was a thing coming that would test him, though he did not yet know its shape, the way there is always a thing coming in these stories that requires a man to stand up in public and pay, in the only currency that means anything, which is his pride for what he broke in private. It came in the form of water. The river that ran along the low fields had swollen with a week of rain, brown and loud and climbing its banks by inches every hour, and one night the old dyke that Eleanor had warned him about 2 years before, that she had noted in the margins of the ledger he had never read, that she had wanted to spend the £200 to repair and been overruled with a careless later, because he had wanted the money for horses and a new carriage, and though he did not think of it now without nausea, for a jeweller in the town, that dyke gave way in the dark. The water came through the breach all at once, and it came into the low farms where his poorest tenants lived, the families who had least and could lose it fastest, and there was no one in the great house who knew what to do, because the person who had always known what to do was living in a cold grey building at the edge of the park. He went down to the flood himself. He had never done such a thing in his life, had never in 40 years put his own hands to a task that a servant could do, but he went, in the rain, with the lantern light swinging wild, and the water rising cold and brown around the legs of the horses, and he found the tenants standing helpless in the dark, trying to save what they could. A cow bawling somewhere, a child crying, a man wading chest deep after a floating door on which some family's whole store of winter grain had been piled. And he found, standing already among them, wet to the waist, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her grey skirts gone black with mud, giving orders in a clear, steady voice that men twice her size were obeying without a moment's question. His wife. She had come down from the dower house the very moment she heard the first shout carried across the park, because the low farms were on the estate whose accounts she had kept for 3 years, and she knew every family in them by name, knew which mother was near her time, and which old man could not walk, and which cottage stood lowest. And she was not a woman who could stand dry on a hill and watch children pulled from the water while she considered whether it was her place. She had simply gone. He came to her through the flood, the water dragging at him, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and the rain came down between them, and the lanterns hissed. Then she told him, in the same voice she was using on the men, exactly what needed doing. The sandbags must go there, at the corner where the current pushed hardest, not there where the fool of a bailiff was piling them. The Wren family must come out first, all of them, because the grandmother could not swim and the water was in their kitchen already. 2 men to the byre for the beasts, no more, for more than 2 would only drown trying. He did not argue. He did not draw himself up and remember that he was a duke and she a wife who had left him. He took his coat off, his good coat, and let it fall in the mud where he would never find it again, and he went where she told him to go, and he set his own shoulder to a sandbag. And he waded into the black water after the Wren grandmother, and carried the old woman out on his back, with her thin arms locked around his throat, and her voice praying in his ear, and he did the work through the whole of that long night. The roughest and coldest and most frightening night of his soft life, in front of every tenant on the estate, taking his orders from her. And when at last the grey light came up over the ruined fields, and the water began grudgingly to fall, and the worst was known to be past, and the count was made, and every soul was living, the men who had spent the night pulling their neighbours from the flood stood in the wet dawn and looked at their duke, mud to the eyes and shaking with cold, and at their Duchess beside him. And they had seen him take her orders, and they had seen that the orders were good, that she had known the ground and the families and the water better than any man there. And the story of what had happened at the court began, quietly in the way of these things, at kitchen tables and over hedges, to be told a different way. He did not presume upon the flood. That was the first truly wise thing he had done in a long time. He did not go to her the next day with the mud still on his boots and the memory of the old woman's arms still about his neck, expecting the night's work to have bought him anything, because he had begun, at last, to understand her. And he knew that she would trust deeds and not the memory of a single dramatic night, that a woman who has been taught what a man's grand gestures are worth will always, and rightly, wait to see what he does on the ordinary mornings after. So he waited. He put the estate in order, or tried to, and where he could not he sent word to the dower house, asking, not commanding, phrasing it as a question and signing it plainly, and she answered. And the answers were curt and exact and contained no warmth at all, only the information requested and not a syllable more. And he did not complain of their coldness, not even to himself, because he knew he had bought that coldness at the court with his own soft voice and must now pay it off in full. He had the dyke rebuilt, and he had it rebuilt to her specifications, the ones from the margin of the ledger, the £200 spent at last and gladly, and he made certain, without making a show of it, that every tenant on the estate knew whose plan the new dyke was, that it was her foresight, and not his, that would keep their kitchens dry in the winters to come. And when at last some weeks had passed, and the frost had come again and softened and come again, he went to the dower house alone and on foot, in the plain flat light of an ordinary afternoon, with no rehearsed speech and no gift in his hand. And he knocked at the door like a man calling upon a stranger, and when she opened it, he did not step across the threshold until she had stood aside to let him. He did not make excuses. This was the thing that told her, more than any word he actually said, that something in him had genuinely and perhaps permanently moved. because the man she had married had been made almost entirely of excuses, of reasons why the fault was always somewhere else, in the steward, in the weather, in the failings of other people, and the man standing in the cold doorway of the dower house offered her not one. He told her what he had done. He named it, without softening the shape of it. He said that he had told her to kneel because he had been afraid of what he had begun to feel for her, that he had felt the fondness turn to something with a pulse in it, and had been terrified by it, because he had learned as a boy that to want a thing openly was to be found weak, and to be found weak was to be left, and that rather than risk being left he had struck first, had made himself certain of the distance between them by putting the whole width of a court between them, and that this was the act of a coward, and he did not dress it in any better name. He said that he did not ask her to forgive it, and did not think that she should, that some things a person does are not owed forgiveness, and are only owed a lifetime of not doing them again. He said that he had mistaken a woman who flattered him for a woman who cared for him, because no one in his whole life before her had ever cared for him, and so he had not known the difference by its taste, and that this was an explanation, and he wished her to understand that he knew it was not an excuse, that he knew now the difference between those two things as well. And then he said the thing that cost him the most to say, being a proud man and a private one. He said that he had read her margins. He said that he had sat up the whole of a night with the ledger and read every note she had made in 3 years, and that he had found in them a better mind than his own, keeping his house standing while he squandered what it earned, and that he was ashamed, not with the hot, quick shame of a man caught out, but with a cold, settled shame that he expected to carry to the end of his life, and that he had come to tell her that the estate was hers, that it had always, in every way that mattered, been hers, and that whatever else she decided, that would not change. Then he stopped, because he had come to the end of the things a man can say, and he waited, and the silence in the cold little room was the silence of the great hall on the night she had knelt, but turned now entirely the other way, for now it was he who stood exposed in the middle of it, and she who watched. She did not fall into his arms, because she was Eleanor, and because the women in these stories who are worth the telling never do. She answered him with precision, the way she answered everything, standing very straight by the cold hearth with her hands folded before her. She told him that she did not want an apology so much as she wanted a change that she could measure, that words were the cheapest thing a rich man owned, and she had no more use for them, having been given a great many fine ones in her life, and found them all to be air. She told him that if he truly wished her to return, he would defend her place ordinarily, as a plain matter of course, not as a grand gesture performed once before a crowd and then set down, but as the ordinary, unremarkable habit of a man who simply knew whose wife she was and did not think it worth remarking on. He would never again in his life ask her to make herself small in order to make another woman large. And he would earn her back, if he earned her at all. Not on the strength of one flood, however cold the water and however brave he had been in it, but on the strength of a great many ordinary days in which he was, quietly and without any applause at all, the man he had shown himself capable of being on the worst night of the year. "I will watch you," she said, and her voice did not shake. "Not your speeches, your habits, what you do when you have forgotten to perform. If you fail, I will go, and I promise you that the next time I will not be found by any river. Do you understand me?" He said that he understood her. He did not bargain, did not plead for a shorter term or a warmer word, having learned at last that she was not a thing to be negotiated with, but a person to be earned, and he went away from the dower house that afternoon with nothing settled, and, for the first time in his life, everything at last honestly begun. The proof took a season, because change that is real always takes a season. And it is built of small things and not large ones, of 100 unwitnessed mornings and not one witnessed night. He defended her at the assembly, the very assembly the mistress had wished to wear the sapphires to, and he defended her not with a speech, but with a fact, when a sharp-tongued and status-hungry lady made a barbed little remark within his hearing about a duchess who kept her own accounts like a tradesman's daughter. And he answered, mildly, not even turning fully toward the woman, that his wife understood the estate better than any man in the county, and that he counted himself fortunate in it. And he said it as though it were the most ordinary observation in the world. A remark about the weather, which was exactly the way Eleanor had asked him to say such things, and the sharp lady found she had nothing to say back. And, most tellingly of all, Eleanor was not even in the room to hear it, which was how he knew, walking home in the cold, that he had begun to mean it. For a thing done for an audience is a performance, and a thing done to an empty room is a character. He wrote to her not with declarations but with questions about the mill lease and the low meadow and whether the Wren family's roof had been made good, and she answered. And over the weeks the letters grew, by degrees so small he did not notice them until they had accumulated, a fraction less cold, a line longer. And there came a grey morning when he noticed that she had signed one of them not with her title, but with her name, only her name, Eleanor, at the foot of a page about drainage. And he sat with that letter in his hand by the window for the better part of an hour, and did not ring for anything. And it was the child who brought them the rest of the way, as the old aunt had known from the first that she would. For the child had begun again to walk across the park to the dower house to do her figures with the Duchess, the pen held once more in her own small hand. And one grey afternoon the Duke walked with her, only to see her safely across, he told himself, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and the child, who had no patience for the elaborate slowness of grown people and their wounded dignities, took him by the hand and pulled him bodily into the room before either of the two careful adults could arrange their faces, and there was nothing for it then but to sit down at the table where the accounts were spread, the three of them in the light of the single lamp, and to be, for one ordinary unremarkable hour, something very like a family. And no one spoke of it, and no one dared to name it, and that was precisely how it began, at last, to be true. She came back to the great house in the spring, on her own terms and in her own time, when she had satisfied herself, over a long patient season of watching, that the man she was returning to was not the man who had told her to kneel, but the man who had taken her orders in the flood and defended her when she was not there to hear it, who asked and did not command, who had spent the £200 and worn out his pride on 100 ordinary mornings, and the household felt her return the way a walled garden feels the coming of the thaw, a loosening, a warming from the corners inward, the exact reverse of the cold that had crept in when she left. The old jewels came out of the locked drawer and were worn by the woman they belonged to. The accounts were kept, from then on, by the two of them together, at the same table, under the same lamp, his careless hand and her clean one side by side down the columns at last. And it was said afterward, by the servants who see everything and forgive most of it, and by the aunt who missed nothing and lived spitefully and triumphantly a great many more years, and by the child who grew up in that warmed house and would tell the story all her life to children of her own, that the Duke changed in one particular way that he never afterward changed back. For in all the long ordinary years that followed, in the settled and unspectacular happiness that these two careful people built between them stone by stone, a happiness that came in time to have a child of their own in it, it became the fixed and unbreakable habit of the Duke, whenever the two of them entered a room together, a hall, an assembly, a court, any place at all where rank is measured in the space between one person and another, to cross the whole of that room, however crowded, however watched, to where his wife stood, and there, in front of whoever happened to be looking, to bend and to take up her hand and to press his lips to it, once, lightly, and then to straighten, and to stand beside her, one pace behind and to the right, where a man stands who has learnt at last, and dearly, and only just in time, exactly what he was given, and exactly what he so nearly threw away upon a cold marble floor. He never once explained the habit, and she never once asked him to, and only the two of them, and the old aunt while she lived, and the grown child, ever knew that the gesture was the answer to another gesture, in another hall. In another and colder life, the deliberate inversion of a cruelty into a devotion, a slipper kissed on cold stone before a crowd made right at last by a hand kissed in the warm and private light before the same kind of crowd. And that was how the family told the story ever after. On winter nights, with the snow pressed like a hand against the tall windows and the fire built high, and no one sent to kneel to anyone, the story of the Duchess who was told to kiss a slipper, and who knelt, and kissed it, and rose, and smoothed her skirts, and walked out of that bright hall entirely alone, and who was followed at last, across every room for the rest of both their lives, by the man who had finally understood that the only thing in this world worth the having is the very thing you are willing to cross a crowded room and bow before, in front of everyone, and be glad.